I was dreaming of a new shirt to do me for the summer as I sat in the cafe of a large department store. I drifted through the checkout with a tray of food I didn't really want. I felt that the chicken goujuns were a mistake. But I ate mechanically, distracted by the antics of an elderly woman at another table. She was eating her own sandwich. She took it out of her handbag while her husband was paying for 2 teas at the checkout. She looked as pleased as the Queen of England did when she was presenting her sandwich to Paddington Bear, although the man with the tray of teas didn't seem entirely amused. Personally, I've never consumed food in a restaurant that wasn't prepared by the restaurant. I've never brought food into a restaurant, whether in a handbag or not. I think it undermines the dignity of the people who work there. And from the severe look on the face of Paddington Bear when he joined her with the mugs of tea, I suspect that he was of the same opinion. To be fair to her, she offered him a piece of sandwich, which he refused with a firm hand gesture and an expression of moral revulsion that Jonathan Swift would not have surpassed. They sipped their tea in silence. She looked everywhere except at him, like a cat worried about a broom handle that might descend on her at any moment. He, on the other hand, gazed at her all the time as if maybe he loved her too much. I remarked to myself on the size of his head, bald and round like a football, adorned with sparse wisps of grey, which contrasted with her bird-like knob and spindly legs. She had a bright blue coat wrapped around her, and she wasn't unlike a hen in its nest. When she had consumed every morsel of the sandwich, folded the wrapping paper into quadrangles, and returned to the handbag, she wiped her lips with a tissue and smiled like a child who has just consumed the finest sandwich in the world. It was when she tried to raise herself from the table that I realized she could barely walk. He sprung up like a greyhound, held her chair back and really raised her up by holding his forearm under her oxter. He placed a walking aid in her hand and held her shopping bag until she had manoeuvred herself out from the table. He whispered something in her ear at that moment, and she almost fell down laughing. Maybe he said something about the sandwich. Clearly he wasn't as rigidly moral as I had supposed. I was witnessing the intimacies and exquisite tenderness of mature love. What illness afflicted her, I don't know. What hardships they might have endured in their lifetime, I cannot say. But it was clear that they enjoyed each other's company, and their little world of mischief and curiosities was precious to them, because their faces glowed with a kind of joy that cannot be named as they passed me on their way to the escalator. Whether the young woman who wiped the table after them was aware of the provenance of those crumbs, I don't know. She may not have noticed the elders leave, and They had ascended to the ladies' department on the next floor by the time she arrived. The store logo was emblazoned on the back and front of her uniform, and to my astonishment she too produced a sandwich from the wide pocket of her apron before she sat. I presumed she was on her lunch break. She sipped sparkling water and ate her sandwich, but never once took her eyes off her phone. Fingers hopping across the screen, texting joy or gossip to some stranger far away in the ether. And she smiled as she waited for every reply. Perhaps she too was absorbed by love. When I was looking for the new shirt later, I noticed the elders negotiating the revolving glass doors onto the street. And it struck me that maybe they didn't like the chicken goujons on a previous visit. Maybe she refused to return ever again unless she could bring her own sandwich with her. And who is to say what will happen, the young woman? Perhaps she too will reach old age in the company of someone who loves her, as she dawdles around like a queen, making picnics in restaurants with Paddington Bear. I must say that sometimes I write a story like that in the newspaper, and I get an enormous satisfaction because it allows me to see more clearly than I normally do. In other words, when you're doing the column, you have to discipline yourself to see where the story is. And you watch what's happening on the surface. You know, the elderly couple, her taking that sandwich from her handbag, him coming and looking at her like he's not too happy, and then eating it, and then the fun in them, the fragility when she tried to get up and I realised there's something really wrong with her health and he's minding her, and yet there was a great laughter between them as they waddled off towards the escalator. And then you're watching the young woman come and her cleaning the crumbs, and you're thinking, you know, she doesn't know that those crumbs came from a sandwich that your woman brought in her handbag. But then she too has her sandwich, she has her life, she has her sandwich. And she sits and she's having her lunch break and she's into her phone. And then I think that too may be love. And maybe the beautiful thing is to think of when she's older, she will be like dawdling around having picnics in restaurants with Paddington Bear, or with her beloved, if you like. And I thought, you know, the wonderful blessing of doing the columns is that you're out scouting for a story, something happens and you notice it, and you have to follow it at the surface level. And you have to be very sharp to come home then and see where the story is. And you have to conjecture to some extent, you know, the kind of metaphor and colour of the story, so that it opens out for the reader. Because like a story has to have a metaphor, it has to be a metaphor. To some extent, I think there's a storytelling that's becoming more fashionable now. And it's a storytelling where really the story is only illustrating a point of view, you know, an ideological position, an argument, an idea. So the story kind of illustrates it. So let's say you have, a story about a woman being abused in a marriage. And so the story illustrates the idea that a lot of women are abused in marriage and it shouldn't happen, we should do something about it. It brings you into all sorts of imperatives, moral imperatives. And in that sense, some modern stories are like propaganda. They may be propaganda for very good ideas. It may be a very, very beneficial thing to write stories about how, let's say, somebody is abused in order to highlight to the listeners the need to change that injustice. But at the same time, for me, they don't reach the level of storytelling at its best, the highest level, whereby the story maybe is full of metaphors, or alternatively, the very story itself becomes a metaphor. Now, it's hard to say whether that story stands up to such an aesthetic demand. It would be a high bar. But I think that all storytelling needs to find a metaphor. And I suppose that there are things happen in that story that carry in a metaphoric way the idea of love. Let me share with you another one. And this happened in Birmingham during the summer. The taxi man was from Africa, and it was his eyes in the rear-view mirror that captured me as we drove through Birmingham. Initially, I couldn't find him or the white Toyota I had booked with Uber. I was walking in the wrong direction at the airport until he tooted the horn from a distance. If my good wife had been here, she would have corrected me, I said apologetically. I'm always going in the wrong direction. She steers me right. That is the value of a wife, he laughed. They steer you. And he showed me his wedding ring and said he was 25 years married, and that's when I noticed his eyes in the mirror, like an ocean of joy. I was in Birmingham to attend a birthday party and meet relations, so I lodged myself in a small hotel on the Coventry Road and went shopping. Would you have a waistcoat in black? I asked the attendant in a clothing store near Spark Hill. He sized me up and said, You will be a 44, and then instantly produced a garment that fitted perfectly. I said, I am so pleased. All I need now is something to eat. I'd love to taste some spices from Pakistan or Afghanistan. Go to the Kabul Darbar on Ladypool Road, he said, without hesitation. Which I did. I sat in the corner while a family of 9 commanded a table beside me, presided over by an elderly gentleman in a pakol hat who kept a close eye on me. I ate a mighty stew of lamb and spice with naan bread served on a hanger that stood on the table beside my plate. The family ate joyfully too, the adults taking photographs and the children licking their fingers, and the elder still watching me with the eyes of an old lion. I left the premises with a glad heart and rested not far away on a bench where I met a woman from Nigeria. And it was her eyes too that I noticed first as she approached. For no particular reason I greeted her in Irish, and she inquired as to what the language was. Irish, I replied. Hausa is my mother tongue, she said, but I was born and reared in London. Her eyes were as sad as 2 small lakes on an autumn afternoon. Do you often visit Nigeria? I wondered. No, she said. It is my home, but I was there only once, 7 years ago. I didn't like the mosquitoes and I got ill, but I liked the village. It was very slow. She spoke the word slowly, and with unbearable nostalgia. Where I live is like that too, I said. Leitrim is slow. Slow is good, she said. I come to Sparkhill for avocados and to pay my electricity at the pay point. I'm here for a party, I said. 'Twas a long way to come for a party, she thought, and the more I told her, the sadder she became. But the taxi driver on the way back to the hotel was great fun. I am from just outside Islamabad, he declared. So I said I was from just outside Drumshambo. We are all the same, he concluded. We all live just outside somewhere. And more than anyone else that day, he had beautiful eyes. Before closing the door of his car at the hotel, I said, You laugh a lot. You must be happy. And he said, Yes. And he laughed again. I tried on the waistcoat in the hotel bedroom, and that evening I wore it to the do. The music was country and the dancing was wild, and I jived with relations and strangers until late in the night. And the following day we reconvened at noon to watch the Sligo Cavan match on the telly. People tucked into Sunday lunch, and pints were flowing. And when the game was about to commence, everyone stood up for the national anthem. And a woman beside me who knew all the words sang it out like a lark, and the entire pub joined with the television. The walls were lined with photographs of Irish dancers in their costumes and curls, and the players on the screen began chasing the ball, and it was as if everyone there, content with their dinners, had been suddenly gathered into one single village. But all I could think of was the woman on the bench and the look in her eyes when she spoke about home. Well, I loved that Birmingham. I loved that visit. It was only a weekend, but, I didn't know the city, didn't know Birmingham, and I didn't know it was so cosmopolitan, is that the word, or should I say Islamic? Certainly there was a great community of people from Pakistan and another from India. It was just so enriching to sit in like a Kabul restaurant with people dressed very much like they might be in Kabul, except the women weren't being oppressed and forced into those huge big sacks with two little slits for their eyes. But everybody sat around and everybody was having a family day, and it was the same as it might be in some Sunday lunch hotel in the west of Ireland. And I had great amazement when I saw the bread coming and it literally hanging out of a hanger. It was a thing that went on the table, and a steel rod stuck up in it, had hooks on it, and the huge big bread for two people was hung on it. And you'd pull pieces off and eat it with your soup or your stew. Had a lovely time. I'd love to go back to Birmingham. I think again, there's a metaphor in the story rather than the story having a lot of metaphors within it. That in some sense, the home that we long for, that the exile longs for, that the taxi person longs for, we long for home. And sometimes we're joyful because we are at home. And sometimes we're not joyful because we feel we're not at home. And in that story, there's a metaphor for something. There's some sense of, I can't even name it, I can't even say what I'm trying to talk about, because, again, in storytelling, sometimes you can make it in the image, but it's gone beyond where your mind's logic finished. That you can't put words on what the story means. I can't put words on the sense of home, that matters to people, that makes people happy. And people sometimes on the streets of Birmingham, and they may be from Islamabad, and their eyes are smiling at you, and they're so happy, and they're at home. They're at home, and there's other people you might meet in their own hometown where they grew up, and they're not at home. So there's a whole sense where home becomes, it's like a metaphor. It's like there's something underneath this word, something underneath this condition. And the only way that I can describe it is as the imaginal realm. It is heaven, or God, I suppose. Your man says, somebody says, there was a woman said, our hearts are restless until they rest in God. That's home. This sense of home is inside us. It's actually, I'm in this room now, and I'm at home in the sense I'm in the studio shed in the hills above Loch Allen, and you know that because you can hear the rain pelting on the roof there a few minutes ago. But I could be not at home. I could feel alienated from home. And it wouldn't be to do with the geography of where I am in the hills above Loch Allen. It would be to do with something that's unnameable, to feel I'm not at home. And how do I come to a feeling of being at home? How do I, the taxi driver, the one man that I said, he had the most beautiful eyes I had seen in Birmingham. And I mean that because his eyes were full of joy and happiness. And he laughed with me. We said, we're all living outside of somewhere, whether it's outside Drumshambo or outside Islamabad. I smiled at him and he smiled back, and it was like we understood each other because we were both at home. I was away from Leitrim and he was away from Islamabad, but we were both on the street in Birmingham, both at home, because he must have been at home in his heart, inside, at peace, at home. How do you get there? How do you do that? You know what I'm going to say about that, and I won't go on. There is a threshold in your mindfulness, when you're being mindful, practicing mindfulness, or just being mindful, just sitting there by the fire, dozing, or looking out the window, dozing. And there is a threshold where you sink across into a deep infinity of the other, the otherness of God, the sense that you are no longer alone, but you are being minded in some extraordinary way. And that minding, I don't care about like having religion or not having religion or what religion you might have. I don't care, because I know that experience of God's presence, of God's love and care is available to you in your mindfulness if you just go over that threshold and experience the otherness, the very depth of God, the height of God, the breadth of God, the kind of endless, infinite, spatial sense of the universe around you, manifesting consciousness around you and loving you. And that's what home is. That's the beautiful experience. Sometimes too, I love to tell stories about the General. And the General is my very dear friend that I first met in Mullingar 15, 16 years ago. And he's an extraordinary character. There's no point in me describing him. I can only talk about him like in story. Here's one. A man wearing orange lycra shorts and a cycling helmet was sitting outside the Jackalope Cafe at the Shed Distillery in Drumshanbo. I was waiting for the General, but he hadn't arrived, and so I chatted with the cyclist. He didn't look like an athlete. He was so puce in the face that I thought he might be on the verge of a coronary event. You look very winded for a man that was just pedalling a bike, I suggested. He said, I was cycling around Sheemore and I stopped for the view and then I decided to climb up. I said, no wonder you're winded. You'd not see me on the top of Sheemore. He looked at my distended belly and said, perhaps you should try some cycling yourself. It was a fair point, but as I said to the General later when he arrived, I have no intention of getting up on a bicycle ever again. Then we brought our coffees outside, since there had been rumours all morning that the sun might make a brief appearance before noon. I explained to the General that the Jackalope Cafe is where anybody who is anybody comes nowadays for a coffee or lunch. He said, I didn't know that there was a chattering class in Drumshanbo. The chattering classes, I declared, come from far and wide nowadays, and the buns in the Jackalope Cafe are second to none. I'm delighted the General is back. I was afraid he might not make it through COVID. He had phoned me from Mullingar the previous day. I'm home, he declared. My God, I exclaimed. I thought you were dead. He said, I escaped. I said, you can't escape from a nursing home. You were discharged. It wasn't a nursing home, he said. It was a care centre. I had COVID, but I'm over it. Well, I'm delighted to hear that, says I. I shall come visit you tomorrow, he announced in a foghorn voice across the phone. He uses WhatsApp to save money. But he must have had a bad internet connection because I couldn't hear a word he was saying. It was as if he was calling from Mongolia. I shall come up to see you. I said, you have no transport. Au contraire, he declared. I bought a jeep. And he duly arrived. And there we were, just outside the cafe, where he kept a beady eye on the other customers. The man in the lycra was fingering a croissant. So if you're not going to get a bicycle, the General said, perhaps you should try golf. Now, I don't like golf, I confessed. When I was 10, I tried it, but I was useless, so I gave it up. In fact, I gave up football, tennis, chess, Scrabble, and even Monopoly because I was useless. And it takes an extremely low level of self-esteem to conclude that you're no good at Monopoly. I had visions of the General arriving in an €80,000 Jeep with digital screens and quadraphonic sound, but I was wrong. I am investing in horses, he explained. So he actually arrived in a 1999 Toyota Land Cruiser. The farmer who sold it to me said he'd prefer to see this vehicle come up his laneway rather than anything made in the past 20 years. These old Jeeps were assembled better. He opened the back door so I could admire it. But it's a shambles, I exclaimed, looking at the empty whiskey bottles and taking in the stale smell of unwashed stable blankets. Admittedly, she's not a show pony, he said, caressing the rusted tow bar, but she's a mighty workhorse. A coat hanger was protruding from the aerial socket on the bonnet. I can even get BBC, he said, when I'm driving around Fermanagh. And what were you doing in Fermanagh? I wondered. Looking at horses, he declared. I'm going to buy and sell on a quick turnaround. You see, I'm back to my old self. Well, at least you survived COVID. I did, he agreed, triumphantly. And we must be positive. We are still young men. We climbed into the jeep and fastened our belts. The cyclist was licking his fingers. By the way, the General remarked, I can understand the need for hemlets, but why the garish padded lycra? It was rhetorical, and I offered no reply. The General pushed the pedal to the floor, and sufficient fumes emerged from the back end of the vehicle as would make an entire club of cyclists weep with despair. What I like about the General is that he is politically incorrect. He doesn't care about the environment. He's a misogynist. He is just an appalling kind of person, and to be with him is a joy. Obviously, not because I'm that kind of person, but because I'm the opposite. I'm a reasonable person. I tried to do my best for the environment. I tried to respect women and not be a boring old man, patriarch. And yet I enjoy the General, who is all those bad things. And when I write about him in the Irish Times, people enjoy him particularly, and they say it to me. We love reading about the General. And I wonder why, because I suppose the answer is the Irish Times is such a politically correct paper, and, you know, it's always on the right side of certain political agendas in relation to morality and society. You can't imagine the Irish Times having a politically incorrect editorial about, let's say, refugees or immigrants or black people or women. It marks the card in a very positive way on all the right kind of positions for political correctness. So it's a great joy to be writing in the Irish Times about this old fart, this old, you know, conservative, boring misogynist called the General. And people love listening to stories about him, and they love reading about him. And don't ask me to explain why that is. But again, I suppose what I'm trying to do in stories is to tell stories that have a sense of metaphor about them. And it's not individual things in the story that has a metaphor, but for me, it's that the story itself is a metaphor. So I go round and I find ordinary life, and I find some ordinary thing happens. Either I'm observing it like the two people that are in the restaurant, or I'm part of it because I've invited somebody like the General to come and visit me, and we meet in the Jackalope and we're having lunch. So either way, there's an event going on which I try and pay attention to as much as I can, get every detail right of what the person is saying, or whatever. I sometimes even would make notes. And then when I write that up, I pare it down to the essential story. And I always find that it leads me somewhere else. So there's always a transition in the story that leads me to something completely different or in a different landscape. And those transitions are, for me, the key hinge in a story. They're the best thing about storytelling. If you're writing a story and you understand what a transition is, then you're gonna go far, because it's the key to the story. And whether the story, I think, is a novel or a memoir or an anecdote, like these are anecdotes from the newspaper, but they're stories and they contain the kind of structure of stories. And the issue about transition, I use it nearly all the time in the Irish Times. It is that you're speaking of one thing, and then by a simple hinge, you go off on a tangent and you're talking about something else. A good example would be when I'm in Birmingham, I'm going to a party, and then I get a taxi, and then I'm talking about all that stuff, which is a world of Kabul restaurants and a world of, Nigerian woman sitting on seat talking to me about home, going home to Africa, even though she was born and raised in London. And then you transition back to the Irish club where there's pictures of old-fashioned Irish dancing competitions on the wall, and people are joining in with the national anthem on the television. And it's moving from one of those worlds to the other. What you need is a link that gets you from one to the other. So the link in this is that I was at the party, I went over to Birmingham for the party, but I also wanted to get away and experience Islamic Birmingham and go shopping in the Pakistani area and the Indian area. That's what I wanted. So I go off. So the taxi that takes me away, if you like, helps me transition in the story to move from one narrative world to a completely different one. And that happens in most of my stories in the Irish Times. When I'm telling an anecdote, I tell it and make sure that whatever world it is that I'm speaking about, somewhere along the line, there is a transition to a completely different world. And making the two join together, that is the entire key of storytelling. But I'd like to share one more with you. I bought an old clock in an antique shop for €5. It looked Edwardian, but in fact there was a slot for batteries at the back. When I installed them, it still didn't work. And I was annoyed at losing €5. But then I noticed a wren stretched on the floor. There was no wound or trace of a cat's claw, no bile or bulge or mark of poison. Even the tail feathers seemed beautiful in one so small. And her death put my own frustrations with the clock in context. She probably died from thirst, having been trapped in the studio for a week while I was away. So I gave her a proper send-off with prayers for her little soul and apologies for trapping her as I dropped a handful of feather and bone over the cliff at the end of the garden. Her fragility reminded me of a friend who died in COVID times. An elderly lady trapped in a nursing home, thirsting for family members who couldn't visit. She was so fragile at the end that her bones made little difference to the weight of her coffin. Well, all life is fragile, I suppose. The clock that didn't work was still annoying me, and I thought maybe a bit of gardening would cheer me up. But the strimmer remained untouched in the shed since last year, hanging from a rafter and entangled in cobwebs. It took almost an hour to find the strimming line, thread it into the head of the machine, and then mix petrol and oil in the proper proportions. It was almost noon and not a weed yet cut. 3 years ago, I was cutting rogue branches with a chainsaw. I wore earmuffs, goggles, industrial gloves, and a protective vest. I was wary of the chain breaking, jumping or throwing the machine backwards into my face. But I was in a very sour mood, and it was when I dropped the chainsaw to my side, with the blade still running, that it caught my trousers. I felt the teeth of the saw on my skin for a moment as it cut through the cloth. I managed to flick the emergency brake just in time. I was lucky, and so shaken that I dropped the saw on the ground and wobbled up to the house, vowing never again to bring anger into the garden when working with machines. But the line in the strimmer wasn't going to harm anyone. That is, unless you were a frog, and the man with the machine was frustrated because his clock didn't work, and it had taken him an hour to get the machine going, and it was almost lunchtime, and he was flying fast through the long grass without taking any account of other sentient beings in the universe, like, for example, the little green frog. I realized what I had done when I saw the frog leap out of the grass, headless and bleeding. 2 leaps. Then she stopped, her heart bursting under the skin until her body gave up. I don't know if the frog was female. For all I know, it might have been a male with a great future in the slushy drains of Leitrim, but that's beside the point. What disturbed me as I sat on the patio trying to recover from my blunder was the shed full of killing machines. Suddenly I saw all my garden equipment as lethal weapons bringing death and destruction to whomsoever lay in the undergrowth. And that was hard to equate with the notion of a garden as a place of tranquility and peace. At least that's what I thought a garden ought to be. We didn't have wicker chairs or cherry trees when I was growing up, and the lemonade was scarce. But I do remember the serenity of gardens back then, when there were no machines. Just the sound of a few old push lawnmowers coughing in the distance, and hedge clippers chewing their way softly through the escalonia. That afternoon I went to a hardware store and bought a mechanical hedge clippers to tackle the long grass and a slash hook for the brambles. I had finally accepted a ceasefire in my own little wilderness. No more warfare on the ditches, and no more collateral damage. I had done enough killing for one day. The poor wren was not my fault, and the dead clock wasn't a sentient being, but one helpless frog was a frog too many. That's my little eulogy for the frog. I was so sorry. I was traumatized. I had never seen a frog die like that, and never at my hand. And yet I knew when it happened that I had another story, because one of the powerful things you need in a story is a strong image. It's amazing what the listener or the reader will tolerate. They will tolerate something very, very strong. And I remember a writer telling me one time that things dilute from page to telling, or from page to stage. In other words, I write something and I think, gosh, that's too strong, it's too vivid, it's too upsetting. And it's not at all. When it's told, when you speak the words, it's completely different. And that was the case with the image of the frog, decapitated, taking 2 more leaps, and then dying. A sentient being coming to its end. It was a really important moment and a very black image, and it made the story. And again, you'd notice the transitions that happen in it. Particularly when I slip back, let's say, to life when I was a child. That's very often a transition that can be made easily. And it brings you into a different world. Now, the world I went back to in this little story was Cavan, the serenity of gardens when there was no machines. Just the sound of a few old push lawnmowers coughing in the distance, and hedge clippers chewing their way softly through the escalonia. That's a kind of world that I hope from the 2 images of the clippers and the machine, the push mower, you kind of get back in there to that world of the 1960s. And it has a link. The transition bridge, if you like, is that they're both gardens. So here I am in my garden with a strimmer that ends up killing a frog. But yet the word garden, the idea of garden, becomes a bridge, because I can slip over the word garden, which I'm in, and now I'm in another garden 50 years ago. And that's how the transition works. There's always a need for some word or image or thing that brings you from one little world into another. And that's what I do in the columns. I slip from one world to another. I begin usually with something very ordinary in my own life, and something in it triggers me back to another time or another place. I make that kind of transition, and I use a bridge, an image that will bring me somewhere else. I might be in a train station, and I might be buying a newspaper, and I might be talking to the man behind the counter, and let's say he's from Pakistan and he talks Irish. That's a true fact. I wrote about that in the Times recently. Wonderful man. And he was Pakistan, but he spoke Irish. He'd learned Irish, and there he was chatting in Irish, and that was the moment. And I could take that little world and then pick some image within it, let's say the newspaper, and I could use the newspaper to transition somewhere completely different. So let's say I was writing or saying, I was in the train station in Cork one morning and I was speaking to a man who was from Pakistan. He was actually in the shop selling the newspapers, and he handed me He handed me the Guardian, and I paid him, and he spoke in Irish. Now, next sentence could be either about him speaking in Irish, which would keep me in the one place, or I could just suddenly take a transition on the bridge Guardian, the word Guardian, newspaper. So the next sentence could easily be, I remember the first time I actually paid for the Guardian newspaper was in Manchester when I was at a conference about young offenders. And now I'm going to bring it to a totally different world where I was at a conference in Manchester many, many years ago, and what all happened at that conference. And the way I get to it, the way I link it, is through the newspaper called The Guardian that the man in the Cork train station is selling me. And that's the way a transition works. So you need transitions to bring you to another little world when you're in a story, and you need strong, strong images in the story, and you also finally need in some way that the story itself or the images within the story are metaphors, that they mean something more, not that they're symbols, but that they mean something more than what they mean at the surface. And I leave that there and talk about it at a later stage. It's a big subject. I hope you enjoyed those little anecdotes, and I hope that you have a wonderful weekend. Next week I'll be starting Advent. I hope you join me. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.